Example 1. Given the function f of x equals x squared plus 6x plus 9, identify the key features of its graph, the extremum, vertex, and y-intercept. Then sketch the graph. Alright, so what we're going to do here is we're going to identify the important parts of the graph, and then with that key information, it's actually going to help us sketch the graph a little bit easier. The first thing I want to do is notice what form is our function in. And this is actually going to be in standard form. Now, standard form is always going to be a times x squared plus b times x plus c. Alright, a, b, and c are going to be numbers. In this case, the easiest one to point out here is the number in front of x, which is b. In this case, is going to be 6. So we know b is 6. 9 is going to be our c, which is the number without a letter or a variable. And a, there isn't a number in front of x squared, but that means that's 1. And we don't write 1s in functions and stuff. It's just tedious, and we don't need to write them over and over again. Alright, so with this information, we just identified little parts of it. We haven't identified the extremum, the vertex, the y-intercept just yet, but we identified a, b, and c, which is going to help us out. Alright, the first thing we want to do is determine the extremum of the graph. Extremum is a fancy word for just saying, is this graph going to have a maximum or a minimum? So we know we're going to have a maximum or a minimum. What you want to look here is that number a, or the letter a, which in this case is 1. When a is positive, we're going to have a minimum. When a is negative, we're going to have a maximum. So in this case, for our function in this case, x squared plus 6x plus 9, we are actually going to have a minimum. Because a is going to be positive. It's 1. It's not negative 1 or negative anything else. It's just a positive 1. That's the most important part thing. And which also tells us that this graph is going to look something like this. It's going to open upward, look like a smiley face, and it's going to have a minimum, which is going to be down here. Alright, so we're just identifying little parts. Next thing we want to do is determine the vertex of the graph. The vertex is going to be at the bottom of our smile. That's going to be pretty much where the graph gets cut down the middle perfectly, and it's going to be the minimum point, the most bottom point, if you want to say it that way. Now, the vertex, like every other point on the coordinate system, is going to be written as x, y. Alright, so that's our coordinate point, x and y. We're on an xy plane. And in order to figure out our x, we actually have to use a formula called negative b divided by 2a. This is the formula we use to figure out x, and then to figure out y is actually going to be plugging in the x. I'm going to write it like this, function of x. Alright, so we'll figure out our x using this formula, and then our number we're going to plug in for x, and that will give us our y. So in this case, we got negative b, so we identified b as 6, so negative 6 divided by 2 times a, and a was 1 in this case, which is going to be negative 6 divided by 2, which means negative 3. So we know that one piece of our vertex is going to be negative 3. Now we need to figure out the y. Now in this case, we're just going to plug it into our formula. So f of x, which is going to be f of negative 3, says that now that I replace that x with negative 3, everywhere there's a negative 3 in my function, I'm going to replace it. So negative 3 squared plus 6x, which is going to be negative 3, plus 9. Negative 3 squared, when you type this in the calculator, make sure you use the parentheses, because the answer is 9, and if you don't use parentheses, you're going to get negative 9. It's going to mess you up. And then we have 6 times negative 3, which is going to be negative 18, and then plus 9. Now, some simple math, this is actually going to become 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 0 and put it in the y coordinate of my vertex. So now we have a vertex of negative 3, 0. The next thing we're going to do is figure out the y-intercept. no matter what you're working with, y-intercept means that the point crosses the y-axis. And with this knowledge, we know that our coordinate is always going to be 0, comma, some number. Alright, 0. It's because this intercept is on the y-axis. We know that it's not moving anywhere but up and down the y-axis, which means that x will always be 0. So if we know x is going to be 0, we can use that information to plug into our function, just like we did for our vertex when we plugged in -3. This time we're going to plug in 0. So wherever there's an x, I'm going to plug in 0. So we got 0 squared plus 6 times 0 plus 9. And what's going to happen here is 0 squared is just going to be 0, 6 times 0 is going to be 0. So all of this just disappears. You can just get rid of it because it becomes 0. And what we're going to look at is that c. So the y-intercept is actually going to equal the c, which equals 9 in this case. So my coordinate for the y-intercept is going to be 0, 9. Okay? So this is kind of like a little shortcut. I mean, if we, just from that, you can plug in x every time, but the y-intercept will be c in standard form. Alright, so now that we know that, we got our minimum, we know it opens up. We have our vertex of -3, 0, which is also our minimum. And we have our y-intercept, so we know where it crosses the y-axis. Next thing we need to do is to sketch the graph. So we know that the y-intercept is 0, 9. And we know our vertex was -3, 0. And we know that this is going to open up and look something similar to that. So I'm going to plot my points. The first one is 0, so I'm going to go 0, 9. And then we have -3, 0. So I just plotted my y-intercept and my vertex. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to get a couple more points here so I can, make a better sketch. I can sketch it now, but it will kind of be a little sloppy because it's going to be hard to make it look good. Alright, so we want to be precise. So we're going to figure out a way to figure out some points here. And the simplest thing is here, if we bring back that knowledge from earlier about the f of x, we can plug in numbers. And then that will give us some answer, which is y. So we have our x coordinate and our y coordinate, and that's what we want. We want x and y's. So I'm going to create a input-output table. And the first thing I'm going to do is I think -1 is a good one. So that means I'm going to plug in -1. So wherever there's a -1, or x, wherever there's an x, I'm going to plug in -1. So you have -1 squared plus 6 times -1 plus 9. 1 squared is going to be 1 plus -6. Another way of writing that is just -6. It's going to be -6 plus 9. And this is going to end up being 4. So when I plug in -1, I get 4. So I'm going to plot this, -1, 4. Okay. Now, you can actually mirror this and create it, or you can just keep putting in numbers for your input-output table. I'm going to go to the left of our minimum, or our vertex, so I can get some points on the left side. Alright, remember now that the vertex here is actually going to be our axis of symmetry. Alright, so that's what cuts our graph in half. So right now we have 1/2 of our graph. If you want to plug in other points, I would go to the left over here. Alright, some points we can use, I already cheated because I already have this stuff written down, is when you plug in -5, you're going to get 4. So I'm going to go to -5 and go up to 4. And then when I plug in -6, I'm going to get 9. So -6, I'm going to go up to 9. And now I have the other half. Another way you can do this is you can kind of cheat. The axis of symmetry, which is cutting down the middle here, is actually it's making it symmetric, which means that everything is evenly distributed on both sides. So if I know this point right here, this is actually 2 spots from the axis of symmetry. If I go 2 spots the other side, I get my other point. Now here, if I go 1, 2, 3 to get the axis of symmetry, start at the axis of symmetry and go 1, 2, 3, I can also plot that point as well. So it could be confusing, but if you understand that, it can also make your life a lot easier. And those are the kind of things you want to do. You want to make your life a lot easier. Try to find some shortcuts or some things that make life easier, because who wants to do stuff that's hard? Alright? I'm signing out. It's too late for this. I'm tired. But have fun, and I'll help you out. Just call me over.